The surgeon pointed at her in front of the entire trauma team and spoke the words she would never forget. "You are inventory." Nothing more. He stripped her badge, called security, and had her escorted out of the building with a cardboard box of her belongings, while every nurse and doctor in that hallway watched in silence. Nobody defended her. Nobody spoke. And 40 minutes later, 40 minutes after he had destroyed her career, with 6 words, that same surgeon was standing in a blood-soaked trauma bay, screaming her name into a radio, begging her to come back. Because the man bleeding out on his table was dying. And she was the only one in that building who knew how to save him. Before we go any further, if this is your first time on this channel, hit the subscribe button right now and turn on your notifications, because the stories here do not end where you think they will. Drop a like and leave me a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now, let's get into it. The supply cart had a bad wheel. It had been bad for 6 weeks. Lena Pruitt had submitted 3 separate maintenance requests, none of which had been processed because the facilities manager at Hargrove Regional Medical Center in Spokane. Washington had a backlog the size of a small filing cabinet and no apparent interest in reducing it. So every morning, Lena pushed the cart through the basement corridor, with one hand positioned slightly lower than the other, compensating for the drag, navigating the long fluorescent stretch from central supply to the service elevator without spilling a single tray of sterile tubing or knocking a box of catheter kits off the side shelf. She was good at compensating. She had been doing it her entire adult life. Lena was 44 years old, and she looked every year of it, not in a way that suggested she had given up on anything, but in a way that said she had been through enough to stop performing otherwise. Her hair was the color of old ash, brown gone gray at the temples, pulled back in a practical knot that she fastened every morning at 5:45, without looking in the mirror. Her scrubs were navy blue, washed so many times the fabric had gone soft at the knees and faded at the cuffs. She had a small scar above her left eyebrow that she never explained, and her hands square-palmed, short-fingered, steadier than most surgical hands in that building, were the hands of someone who had spent years doing precise work in conditions that left no room for hesitation. Nobody at Hargrove Regional knew what those conditions had looked like. They just knew she pushed the cart. Central Supply was her domain, a temperature-controlled room behind the laundry facility on sub-level 2, lined floor-to-ceiling with metal shelving, organized according to her own system that ran faster and more intuitively than anything the hospital's inventory software recommended. She knew where everything lived. She knew what was running low before the automated alerts fired. She knew which departments overordered to cover for poor planning and which ones were genuinely understocked through no fault of their own. And she knew better than anyone else in the building, better than the department heads, and certainly better than the administrator who approved supply budgets from a corner office on the 4th floor that the trauma unit had been operating on equipment margins that were one critical incident away from becoming a serious liability. She had flagged it twice in writing, once to the supply coordinator, once directly to the attending physician who ran trauma operations, a man named Dr. Callum Doyle. He had not responded to either message. This particular Tuesday morning in early March, she loaded the cart with the standard trauma bay, restock IV lines, pressure cuffs, saline bags, 2 sealed trays of emergency suture kits, and the blood administration tubing that the unit burned through fastest when things turned bad. She noted, as she always did, that the supply of large-bore vascular access sets was critically low. 11 units remained in the entire hospital. Protocol minimum for a facility with Hargrove's trauma designation was 30. She had submitted a purchase order for the restock 2.5 weeks ago. It had not been approved. She rode the elevator up, pushed through the double doors into the trauma corridor, and began the restock in her standard order, Bay 1 first, then the supply closet outside Bay 2, then the medication cabinet at the nursing station. She was working through her second bay when she heard him coming. Dr. Callum Doyle moved through the hospital the way certain men move through any space they have decided. Belongs to them wide stride, shoulders squared, voice that carried even when he wasn't projecting. He was 51, lean, with silver at the sides of his dark hair that he hadn't earned through humility. He was a skilled surgeon. Everyone agreed on that. He had fast hands and solid instincts. He had also spent the last decade in a department where nobody above him had ever meaningfully pushed back on anything he did, and that had calcified something in him over the years into a particular brand of confidence that had long since crossed into something else. Came around the corner with 2 residents trailing him, mid-sentence about a morning case, and he stopped when he saw Lena's cart partially blocking the corridor outside Bay 2. He looked at the cart, then at her. Move that. Lena stepped around it and shifted the cart flush against the wall. I was finishing the restock. Almost done. I can see what you were doing. He walked past without slowing, then stopped and turned back. He seemed to reconsider something, or perhaps he simply registered that he had an audience. 2 residents, the charge nurse crossing at the far end of the corridor, a technician near the supply closet who had gone very still. You're the one who's been sending those purchase flag notices to administration. Yes. About the vascular access inventory. We're at 11 units. The protocol minimum for our trauma level is, I know what the protocol minimum is. His voice stayed even. Didn't need to rise. I run this trauma unit. I am aware of what we have and what we need. What I don't need is supply staff sending shortage escalations to the department head and copying risk management, because they cannot distinguish between a genuine inventory gap and a staggered delivery cycle. Lena kept her voice equally level. The delivery schedule doesn't reflect a pending order. The last approved requisition was in December. Are you correcting me right now? Professionally, I'm telling you what the system shows. One of the residents found something interesting to look at on the floor. The charge nurse had slowed her pace without quite stopping. Stepped closer, not aggressive. Exactly more like someone who had learned over many years that proximity was its own kind of pressure. Let me be clear about something. You manage stock levels. You push a cart. You do not assess clinical need. You do not evaluate operational readiness. And you do not copy department leadership on internal memos as though you have standing in this unit's decision-making process. Do you understand that? Lena said nothing. Miss Pruitt, do you understand that? Yes. He held her gaze for a moment longer than was necessary, then walked away. One of the residents, young, dark-haired, maybe second year, with a face that still showed things, glanced at Lena briefly before following. She didn't say anything. Just that half second of eye contact that meant I saw what just happened. And then she was gone, too. Lena pushed the cart the rest of the way down the corridor, completed the restock, made a notation in her phone about the vascular access shortage with a timestamp, and rode the elevator back down to sub-level 2. She had been at Hargrove Regional for 3 years. Before that, there had been other hospitals, other cities, other versions of herself that she had no particular desire to revisit. She had come to Spokane because it was quiet and the position was uncomplicated, and because nobody in this building asked too many questions about the gaps in her employment history, or why a woman with her particular set of skills and institutional knowledge was spending her days managing a supply room in a hospital basement. She had worked very deliberately to arrange things that way. Preferred simple. She had earned simple. 9:47 that morning, a motorcycle accident came into the ER. A 23-year-old male struck broadside at a major intersection, presenting with multiple fractures, significant blood loss, and a blood pressure reading that made the paramedics call it a trauma activation before they'd even reached the hospital. Doyle's team had 4 minutes to prep Bay 1. Lena was not on the trauma floor. She was in central supply working through an audit of a recent saline shipment after someone in receiving had passed a partial pallet without checking expiration dates. She heard the overhead page, registered the activation code, noted the time, and kept working. Upstairs, things deteriorated faster than the team anticipated. The patient's pressure dropped in the elevator between the ground floor and the third. By the time the gurney hit the bay floor, the team was working a hypotensive, semi-conscious young man with a suspected internal bleed and the kind of vitals that meant you didn't have time to debate next steps. Doyle called for a rapid infusion setup. The nurse opened the right side cabinet and pulled the blood administration tubing, the standard kit that lived there. It was insufficient for the situation. The tubing gauge worked for standard IV access. It did not provide the flow rate required for aggressive fluid resuscitation in hemorrhagic shock. The equipment designed for that, the large-bore rapid infuser kits, was staged in the left cabinet beside the door. Except when the nurse opened it, she found 2 kits instead of the 4 that should have been there. One of those had a package crimp along the seal that made it a judgment call no one wanted to make on a crashing patient. She grabbed the intact kit, called out the shortage to the room, and the team adapted. Doyle placed a central line instead, which was the right call, but cost 7 additional minutes. Patient stabilized eventually. After 40 minutes, that left nobody in the room feeling good about how it had gone. Doyle pulled his gloves off in the scrub room and turned to the senior nurse before the door had fully closed behind them. Who restocked Bay 1 this morning? The nurse knew. Everyone in that unit knew. Lena Pruitt, supply staff. Doyle was on the phone with Martin Voss within the hour. Voss was the hospital's director of operations, compact, precise, early 60s, with the demeanor of someone who had spent decades viewing the clinical side of the hospital as a cost center, to be managed rather than a function to be supported. He had an office on the 4th floor with a clean desk and a window that looked out over the parking structure, and he ran his department with the kind of efficiency that looked impressive in quarterly report, felt suffocating to everyone who worked beneath it. Lena was called to administrative at 11:15. She walked in to find both of them already there, Doyle seated to the left, Voss behind the desk, the door pulled shut behind her. No one offered her a chair. She sat anyway. The trauma bay this morning was improperly stocked, Doyle began. Patient's care was compromised because appropriate equipment wasn't available at point of need. Lena looked at him calmly. Bay 1 was restocked at 7:40 this morning. I documented the restock with a timestamp. The large bore kits were insufficient for the clinical situation, were present at the current inventory level, which I flagged as critically low in writing on February 14th and again on February 22nd. If you need those records, I can pull them up right now. What I need, Doyle said, is an explanation of why a routine restock contributed to a clinical problem. The restock didn't cause a problem. The inventory shortage caused a problem. Those are different things. Voss leaned forward slightly. Ms. Pruitt, Dr. Doyle is expressing concern that the equipment staged in that bay was not appropriate for the level of care required. Equipment staged was what we had available. I requested additional stock on February 14th. Order hasn't been approved. She looked at Voss directly. The approval authority for that purchase sits in this office. The silence that followed had a particular quality, not surprise but recalibrating. Voss and Doyle exchanged a glance that Lena had seen before, in other rooms, with other men in comparable positions. Kind of glance that meant a decision had already been made before she walked through the door, and the conversation happening now was administrative procedure, not genuine inquiry. We're placing you on suspension pending a review of your restocking protocols and documentation practices, Voss said. Effective immediately. You'll surrender your badge and access credentials to security before leaving the building. Lena looked at him, then at Doyle. You're suspending me for flagging a shortage that no one here addressed. We're suspending you, Doyle said, his voice settling into something measured and final, because this morning a patient received compromised care in a unit you are responsible for supplying, and we have an obligation to review what happened. You know what happened. I just walked you through it. Miss Pruitt, you didn't approve the restock order. You told me this morning to stay in my lane, and now there's been an incident, and it needs somewhere to land. She said it the way she said everything, without performance, without heat, each its word placed where it needed to go. So it's landing on me. Doyle stood. Security will escort you to collect your personal items from Central Supply. Lena sat still for a moment. She had been in worse rooms. Smaller, louder, with worse lighting and far higher stakes. She had received worse news than administrative suspension and not shown the people delivering it a single thing she didn't choose to show them. That was a skill, and like most of her skills, it had been trained into her the hard way. She stood, straightened her badge out of habit, then unclipped it and set it on the desk in front of Voss. She didn't drop it. She placed it with the same deliberate precision she used for everything, controlled and exact and finished. There are 11 large bore kits in Central Supply as of this morning, she said. You'll want to reorder before the end of the week. If another major trauma comes in before then, you're going to have the same problem. Neither of them responded. She walked out. Security was a young man named Pete, who she knew vaguely from the third-floor break room, quiet, clearly uncomfortable, who walked her down to Central Supply without speaking and looked at a point slightly above her head when she gathered her things. She took her jacket from the hook beside the door, her insulated water bottle, a small framed photograph she kept on the shelf above her workstation. Nothing special, just a landscape and the thick spiral notebook where she kept her handwritten inventory logs going back 18 months. Pete offered to carry the box. She said no. They walked through the main lobby. It was midday, active patients at the check-in desk, a family clustered near the elevator, 2 nurses moving in opposite directions across the open floor. Nobody stopped. A few people looked. The dark-haired second-year resident from that morning was crossing toward the pharmacy window and glanced up from her phone as Lena passed, saw the box, and her face moved through something complicated before she dropped her eyes back to the floor. Lena pushed through the front doors into the March cold. It was overcast and dry, that particular Pacific Northwest gray that sat low on everything and made the parking lot look washed out. Her car was in the far corner, a 10-year-old gray Subaru she maintained with the same systematic attention she gave everything, and she walked toward it without hurrying, box under her arm, keys in her right hand. She was about 40 yards from the entrance when the sound started. Not an alarm, not the overhead page system. A sound that reached her body before her mind had fully processed it, the specific low, heavy rotation of military helicopters, more than one, moving fast and losing altitude rapidly. The sound her nervous system had been cataloged under a different category than civilian medevac. Faster, more deliberate. The kind of approach that said the pilots knew exactly where they were going and had made this kind of landing in places that made a hospital parking lot look uncomplicated. She stopped walking. 2 black helicopters came over the tree line at the eastern edge of the property low enough that she could feel the pressure change in her chest, low enough to flatten her hair against the side of her face and put down in the ambulance turnaround with the compact, no-wasted movement precision of people who landed in contested environments for a living. The rotors didn't power down. The side doors opened while the aircraft was still settling to the ground, and 4 figures dropped out, 2 of them supporting a 5th, whose left leg had been destroyed mid-thigh down. That was the accurate word. Destroyed. Not fractured, not lacerated. Tissue damage visible even from this distance was consistent with blast fragmentation, the fabric of his tactical pants shredded by something that hit with both force and heat, and the tourniquet cinched above the knee was the only reason he still had a pressure reading at all. 3 more figures followed from the second aircraft, armed and armored, moving with the controlled efficiency of a team running on the back half of a very bad day. One spoke into a radio. Another scanned the building's perimeter. The third stopped and looked directly at Lena. Tall, mid-40s, with a face that didn't carry expression so much as convey operational states, and right now that state was urgency, locked down behind the kind of discipline that didn't let urgency become panic. He held her gaze for 2 full seconds, something registering behind his eyes, and then he turned and moved through the emergency entrance. Inside's Lena knew, without looking there, was now a man in irreversible hemorrhagic decline. There was a trauma team that had already had a difficult morning. There was a surgeon who had spent the last hour redirecting blame, and there were 11 large-bore vascular access kits she had tried to warn them about 3 weeks ago. Stood in the parking lot. The helicopter rotors slowed but did not stop. She looked at her car. She looked at the entrance. Then it came through clear, even filtered through the distance, and the wind and the glass of the main doors, a voice cutting through the noise of the emergency bay, with the kind of authority that expected immediate results. Find Echo 7. Somebody in this building find Echo 7 right now. Lena went still. Echo 7, the call sign passed through her like electrical current, not a memory, exactly. More like a frequency her body still knew how to receive even after 5 years of silence. She had not heard that designation spoken aloud since she'd signed the paperwork that closed out that chapter of her life. And she had spent considerable effort making sure she wouldn't. She set the cardboard box down on the pavement. Her hands did not shake. They had not shaken in a crisis since she was 27 years old, and whatever was happening in her chest right now, her hands were not participating in it. The tall man was back at the emergency entrance. He had come back out, and this time he wasn't scanning the perimeter. He was looking directly at her, across 40 yards of cold pavement, and he was speaking into the radio at his collar. She couldn't hear the words at this distance, but she had been reading lips since she was 26, trained in environments where ambient noise made verbal communication unreliable. He said, "I think we have her. Tell them to hold the bay. Stand by." Lena looked at the box on the ground. She looked at the entrance. Then she left the box where it was and walked toward the doors, and the March wind came up behind her like it was pushing and everything she had built in this quiet, deliberate, carefully managed life was about to either matter in a completely different way than she'd planned or come apart entirely. She had learned a long time ago that those 2 outcomes were sometimes the same thing. She pushed through the emergency doors. The trauma bay was in motion, controlled chaos, the kind where everyone was working, but the ceiling was dropping. A nurse called out a pressure reading that was too low. A resident struggled at the bedside, hands moving, face tight. Dr. Callum Doyle stood at the head of the table with his gloves on and his jaw set, and she could read exactly how scared he was by the careful way he was not showing it. The tactical team leader was in the center of the room, radio in hand, armor still on. He turned when she came through the door. He was the man from the parking lot. Up close, she could see the dried blood on his left forearm, not his, and the tension in the line of his shoulders that said the clock in his head was running. He looked at her. Echo 7. Not a question. Lena moved past him toward the table. She assessed the tourniquet position, the damage pattern, the angle of injury. She looked at the monitor readings. She looked at the large-bore vascular kits stacked on the tray to her, left the 11 she had warned them about, which nobody had used yet because nobody in this room had run this particular procedure in a field context. "I need 2 of those kits open," she said, "a pressure bag, and whoever has the steadiest hands right now, holding counter-pressure on the proximal wound margin. You have no authorization to be in this bay." Doyle's voice came from the head of the table, still commanding, still certain, but with something underneath it that was no longer either of those things. Lena pulled on a pair of gloves. Then stop me after he's alive. The room did not go quiet the way it does in films. It was still loud monitors, the helicopter rotors, outside cycling down, someone's radio crackling a status update, the residents' controlled breathing. People in it made a collective decision in the space of about 3 seconds. The dark-haired second-year resident, the same one who had looked away in the corridor, the same one who had watched from across the lobby, stepped forward and placed her hands exactly where Lena had indicated. Pressure, proximal wound, firm and steady. "Tell me what you need first," she said, and Lena told her. Left hand stays where it is. Don't shift pressure. Don't adjust if you feel the tissue moving under your palm. Push back harder and call it out. She was already opening the first kit, tearing the sterile packaging back with practiced efficiency, not rushing but not wasting a single motion either. "Someone give me a pressure reading." 58 over palp, a nurse said from the monitor station. Her voice was steady, but her eyes weren't. "How long since tourniquet placement?" Team leader answered from behind her. 31 minutes. 31 minutes was workable. 31 minutes meant the tissue damage was severe, but the window hadn't closed. Lena had worked within tighter margins than this, in conditions that made a fully equipped trauma bay look like a surgical theater, and the part of her brain that had been trained to treat panic as irrelevant data simply categorized the situation and moved forward. "I need the second kit open and a warm saline flush ready." "Who's running the pressure bag?" A male nurse she didn't recognize by name stepped up. "I've got it. Set it to 300. Don't squeeze it manually if you do. Call it." Doyle hadn't moved from the head of the table. He was still gloved, still positioned, still technically the attending physician in charge of this bay. But he hadn't spoken in 90 seconds, which in a trauma situation was its own kind of statement. "Doyle." She said his name without looking up from what she was doing. "I need you on airway. His sats are going to drop in the next 4 minutes if nobody's watching it." Pause. "I'm the attending physician in this. I know what you are. Airway, please." Another pause shorter this time. Then she heard him move to the head of the table and call for the intubation tray, and that was enough. She didn't need him to agree with her. She needed him functional. The young resident's hands were still exactly where Lena had placed them, counter pressure. Proximal wound margin, not moving, not adjusting. She was sweating at the hairline, but her face was locked into the focused blankness of someone who understood that how they felt about this was not relevant right now. "You're doing fine," Lena said, not as reassurance, but as a data point. "Keep it exactly there." "His pressure's still dropping," the monitor nurse said. 53. "I know." Lena worked the access line into position the large bore kit at the femoral approach, which was not a technique used in standard hospital trauma protocols, which was why none of the other physicians in this room had moved toward it. It was a field technique, military grade, high risk in a facility context, extraordinarily effective when applied correctly. She had done it enough times that her hands remembered the angles without her brain having to narrate them. "Tell me when we're running." "Lines in," she confirmed herself a moment later and connected the pressure bag. "Running now. 2 units of packed red cells, whoever's holding blood. Now." Team moved. Not smoothly. There was a fumble at the blood refrigeration unit. Someone called out the wrong unit type and had to be corrected. The monitor alarmed twice in a row for different reasons, but the pieces came together the way they do when a room full of trained people have a clear enough signal to, even if they don't entirely understand where it's coming from. The team leader had moved to the periphery of the bay. He was not interfering. He was watching Lena with an expression that was not quite recognition and not quite relief, more like confirmation. The kind that comes when something you believed on incomplete evidence turns out to be accurate. His name, she would learn later, was Garrison. Right now, she didn't need his name. She needed the patient's pressure to climb. It didn't climb. Not immediately. It stayed at 51, then dipped to 48, and the monitor issued a sustained alarm that everyone in the room registered and nobody commented on because there was nothing useful to say about it yet. Lena kept her focus on the line, on the flow rate, on the resident's hands, and the pressure bag reading and the angle of the access site. "He's fighting it," she said, mostly to herself. "What does that mean?" the resident asked. Her voice was controlled, but only barely. "It means he's still in there." Lena adjusted the line angle by 3 degrees, which is good. "Keep the pressure." 4 minutes passed. 4 minutes in a room like that is not 4 minutes the way it is anywhere else. It's a different unit of time, denser, more accountable, each second carrying a specific weight because of what it might contain. The monitor continued its pattern. Doyle managed the airway with competence, if not confidence. The nurses ran their assignments. The team leader stood at the edge of the room and did not speak. Then the pressure reading changed. 51. 54. "We're moving," the monitor nurse said, and the quality of her voice was different. 57. 61. Lena didn't exhale. She kept her attention on the access site, watching the flow, watching the tissue response. The wound itself was going to require surgical intervention that couldn't happen in this bay. There was vascular damage that needed an OR and a vascular surgeon, and time, none of which were immediate. Time was now something they had a chance of buying. 66/40, the nurse said. "Pressure's climbing." The resident let out a breath that she had apparently been holding for approximately 4 minutes. Her hands stayed in position. "You can ease the counterpressure now," Lena told her. "Slow, don't release all at once." The resident did exactly that. Slow, controlled, watching the wound response. Doyle looked up from the head of the table. He looked at the monitor. He looked at the patient. He looked at Lena. He said nothing. But something moved across his face that she had no interest in cataloging. She had work to finish, and whatever Callum Doyle was processing right now was his problem to manage. "We need to move him to surgery," Lena said to the room. "Whoever's calling vascular, he needs femoral reconstruction, and he needed it 10 minutes ago. The access line will hold during transport, but don't let it torque. If the angle shifts, call it immediately." "I'll make the call," Doyle said. "Good." She stepped back from the table and stripped her gloves, one at a time, the way you do when you're making sure nothing transfers. The patient was still critical. He would be critical for hours yet. Blood pressure was 68/42 and trending in the right direction, which was the difference between a man who had a chance and a man who didn't. The team leader Garrison moved toward her. He was quieter up close than he'd seemed from a distance. Not soft, just economic. "How long since you ran that approach?" "A while." "Didn't look like a while." "What do you need from me, Garrison?" He paused. She'd used his name without being introduced, which registered on his face a slight adjustment, reappraising something. "You know who I am. Your team patch is visible under your left plate carrier. You ran Echo Group's 2nd unit out of the Eastern rotation." "I haven't been out of it that long." He almost smiled. "Almost. We need to talk." "I know." She looked toward the door where Doyle had stepped out to make the surgical call. But not here. The next 40 minutes had a particular texture. The patient went to surgery, a vascular reconstruction, that would take 3 hours and result in him keeping the leg, which nobody in that OR was willing to predict with certainty at the outset, but which the operating surgeon would later describe as the closest thing to a clean outcome the injury had any right to produce. Lena didn't know that yet. She was in a small family consultation room off the main corridor, the kind with beige chairs and a box of tissues on the table that nobody had replaced in a while. Sitting across from Garrison and a second member of his team, a woman named Dex. Shorter, quieter, with a tablet she kept face down on the table between them. Garrison talked. Lena listened. The patient's name was Rourke. He was one of theirs, she would have known that, from the tourniquet placement alone, which followed a field protocol she recognized. He'd been extracted from a situation that Garrison described in the abbreviated language of someone accustomed to giving briefings to people who already know which questions to ask. Explosion, vehicle-mounted device, partially controlled extraction. 37 minutes to the nearest facility, which had been Hargrove Regional. Why here? Lena asked. Closest trauma center with your profile on file. My profile shouldn't be on file anywhere. I separated. You separated from active duty, Garrison said. You didn't separate from the record. She absorbed that. It wasn't a surprise, exactly. More like a thing she had chosen not to think about that had now chosen not to be ignored. Why did you need Echo 7, specifically? You had a team with you. We had a team. Garrison glanced at Dex, then back. Rourke's injury pattern was specific. The device wasn't standard. The way it hit him, the angle, the fragmentation spread our flight. Medic flagged it in transit as something she hadn't seen before. We needed someone who'd seen that kind of configuration. Lena went still. What kind of configuration? Shape charge, small diameter, short fuse window. The kind of device that's designed to wound rather than kill, specifically designed to keep a target alive long enough to require medical transport. She looked at him. That's not battlefield ordnance. No, Garrison said, it's not. The consultation room was very quiet. The box of tissues on the table looked absurd. Suddenly, the ordinary softness of it against what was being described. You're telling me someone set a device specifically to injure him in a way that required hospital transport. We're telling you we think so. Why? Garrison leaned forward slightly. It's the part we're still working on. But Rourke was carrying something. Information, not material. And whoever hit him either wanted that information or wanted him in a position where someone else could finish the job. In a hospital, Lena said. In a hospital. She sat with that for a moment. The implications of it were not subtle, and she was not someone who needed them spelled out. You need me to stay close to him. We need you to do what you just did in that trauma bay, Garrison said, and we need you to have eyes on whoever comes near him. You know medical environments. You know how things move through them. If someone's going to get to Rourke while he's post-surgical and sedated, they're going to do it through the clinical infrastructure. I was just suspended. I know. I literally walked out of this building with a cardboard box 40 minutes ago. I know that too. He didn't seem particularly concerned about it. We can manage the administrative piece. What we can't manage is the clinical piece without someone who knows what they're looking at. Lena looked at her hands. They were clean. She had washed them thoroughly at the base sink before coming here, which was automatic, the kind of thing you do without deciding to do it. If someone targeted Rourke to get him into a hospital, she said, then they knew he'd be here, or somewhere like here, which means they may already have a path into this facility. Garrison's expression didn't change, but Dex reached for the tablet. That's what we need to find out, Garrison said. Lena didn't go back to Central Supply. She had no reason to. Her keycard was sitting on Voss's desk, and her access to the supply room was technically revoked. But Garrison's team had a temporary credentialing authority that sat above hospital administration, which Lena had seen used twice in her career, and which Voss, when presented with the relevant federal documentation in his own office, received with the expression of a man who had stepped on something unexpected in the dark. He did not reinstate her, but he did not stop her from moving through the building. That distinction mattered to her more than it probably should have. She wasn't here to be reinstated. She was here because a man in a surgical suite 3 floors up had been deliberately wounded by someone who knew how medical facilities worked, and because the team responsible for his safety needed a specific set of skills that happened to live inside a woman. Hargrove Regional had spent the morning trying to erase. She moved through the hospital differently now. Not visibly differently. Same pace, same posture, the same unremarkable quality that had always allowed her to pass through spaces without attracting attention. But her attention was running on a different frequency. She was reading the building the way she had once read environments that were actively trying to kill her, looking at access points, staff movement patterns, clinical systems that someone with enough knowledge could use to reach a sedated post-surgical patient without going anywhere near his room. Medication routing, IV supply lines, monitoring system access points. The third floor was busy in the way. Trauma floors always are not frantic, but loaded, every person moving with purpose, and most of them carrying something. She walked the corridor outside the surgical suites and made a mental map of who was where, which faces she recognized, which ones she didn't. She recognized most of them. She didn't recognize the man in the pharmacy tech uniform near the medication dispensing station outside Suite 3. He was young, late, maybe 30, with a face that was doing something she had learned to identify years ago as studied normalcy. Not relaxed. Normal in the way someone performs normal when they're managing what they're actually thinking. He was standing at the dispensing station with a tablet, and he was doing a reasonable job of looking like he belonged there. But his badge was clipped at the wrong angle. Pharmacy techs at Hargrove wore their badges on lanyards at chest height. She had stalked that department enough times to know it the way she knew the supply shelf configuration in her sleep. Clip badges at that station meant visiting staff or contracted workers who used a different station entirely, 2 corridors over. She walked past him without slowing. She pulled her phone and texted Dex the number she'd been given 20 minutes ago. Pharmacy tech. Dispensing station outside Suite 3. Badge clip, wrong type. Young male, dark jacket under uniform top. Don't move on him yet, I want to see what he does. The response came back in 11 seconds. Confirmed. We see him. Hold position. She held position at the nursing station, 12 feet away, picked up a clipboard from the rack, which she had no authorization to touch, technically, but which nobody questioned because she was holding it the way someone holds something that belongs to them, and waited. The man at the dispensing station entered something on his tablet. He waited. He entered something else. Then he looked up. Not at Lena, at the door to Suite 3. And Lena understood with the specific clarity of someone whose training had been built around recognizing the moment before a situation became unrecoverable, that she had maybe 90 seconds before whatever he was doing moved from preparation to action. She texted Dex. He's accessing the dispensing system for Suite 3. Rourke's suite. You need to pull his queue right now. Whatever he's authorizing needs to be flagged before it processes. She was already moving toward the station, not running. Running draws every eye in a clinical corridor, but moving with the efficient purpose of someone responding to something specific, which is different enough from urgency, that it reads as routine to anyone not looking carefully. The man heard her coming anyway, turned, and she got a clear look at his face, and what she saw there was not guilt or panic. It was the quick, calculating assessment of someone running a decision tree very fast. His hand moved toward the tablet. Lena said, "Don't." Just that. One word, quiet, in the tone she had used in other contexts to stop people from doing things that would make a bad situation worse. It was not a request. He looked at her. She was a woman in a faded navy scrub top with no badge and no visible authority, and for a moment she could see him deciding that she was not actually a problem. Then Dex appeared at the far end of the corridor, and Garrison came through, the door behind him, and the man with the pharmacy tech uniform apparently revised his assessment very rapidly because he dropped the tablet, turned the other way, and moved toward the stairwell door at the end of the hall. He didn't make it. 2 members of Garrison's team had been in the stairwell. The whole thing from Lena's text to the man's hands being secured took 4 minutes. It was not clean. He fought, briefly and without much strategy, and one of Garrison's people took an elbow to the jaw that would produce a significant bruise by the following morning. But it was contained, and it happened in a stairwell where the only witnesses were people who had already been briefed on what to expect. Lena stood in the corridor outside Suite 3 and looked at the dispensing station. The tablet was on the floor, where he dropped it. Crouched and looked at the screen without touching it. He'd gotten as far as authorizing a medication adjustment on Rourke's post-surgical sedation protocol, not a lethal dose on its face. But enough of a shift in the sedation to analgesic ratio that in a patient with Rourke's blood loss and cardiovascular status, it would have created a window, a quiet one, the kind that looked like a complication rather than an action. She knew exactly how it would have been documented. She stood up. Dex was beside her. Good catch. The badge clip. Right. You need to pull his full access log. If he got into that dispensing system, I want to know how long he's had credentials and who issued them. She looked at Dex directly. That's not a walk-in credential. Someone inside this facility provisioned his access. Dex's expression didn't change much, but she picked up her radio. And that was when Lena looked down the corridor toward the administrative wing and saw Martin Voss standing at the far end of the hall. He was too far away to have seen the tablet, too far to have heard the conversation. But he was standing very still, in a corridor he had no particular clinical reason to be in, watching the stairwell door with an expression that Lena recognized, not because she had seen it on him before, but because she had seen it on people in situations where the thing they were watching had not gone the way they expected. Not alarm, not curiosity. Calculation. She looked at him for 3 full seconds. He looked back. Then he turned and walked in the other direction, back toward the administrative wing, at a pace that was careful not to look like hurrying. Lena stood in the corridor and felt something settle into place in her chest. Not satisfaction, not yet, but the specific gravity of a thing that has stopped being a suspicion and started being a problem with an identifiable shape. Pulled out her phone. She texted Garrison a single line, "We need to talk about Voss." His response came back in 8 seconds, already pulling his procurement records. "Come find me." She walked toward the stairwell, past the dropped tablet, past the dispensing station with its interrupted authorization queue, past the suite where Rourke was still in surgery with a vascular team working to repair what a deliberately engineered device had destroyed. She had walked out of this building 2 hours ago with a cardboard box and no badge and the specific defeated weight of someone who had tried to do the right thing and been punished for it by people who found her inconvenient. She was still without a badge. She was still technically suspended. Nothing that had happened in the last 2 hours had formally changed her status at Hargrove Regional Medical Center. But the building felt different under her feet now. And somewhere in the administrative wing, Martin Voss was walking back to his office, and he did not yet know that the woman he had signed off on removing that morning had just watched him from 40 feet away and read every single thing his face was trying not to show. She found Garrison's in the second-floor conference room that his team had quietly converted into a field operations space. Sometime in the last 90 minutes, laptops open, a portable comms unit running on a folding table, printed documents laid out in an arrangement that looked casual to anyone who didn't know how to read it. Dex was already there, standing behind a laptop with her arms crossed, and there was a third person Lena hadn't met yet, a man in his 50s, civilian clothes, with the particular quality of stillness that said federal rather than military. He didn't introduce himself. She didn't ask. Garrison pointed at the chair across from him. She sat. "Voss," he said. "Voss." She put her phone on the table. He was in the third-floor corridor during the interdiction. No clinical reason to be there. His expression when the stairwell door closed wasn't concern, it was recalculation. He was watching to see if something had worked, and when it was clear it hadn't, he left. That's observational. Yes. So pull the procurement records and make it evidentiary. The civilian man looked at her for the first time. Not unfriendly. Evaluating. Garrison turned his laptop to face her. "We started pulling procurement 12 minutes ago. The large-bore vascular access kits, You flagged the ones that weren't reordered. What about them? The December order was fulfilled. Full quantity, 32 units, delivered to Hargrove, receiving on December 19th. Lena looked at the screen. Delivery confirmation, signed and time-stamped. That's not what the inventory shows, she said. No. The inventory shows 11 units, which is what was actually on the shelf when you restocked this morning. So 21 units were delivered to this facility and did not end up in clinical supply. She sat with that for a moment. They were redirected, or pulled after delivery and replaced with something else. We're still tracing the physical chain, but the paperwork shows the order fulfilled and the shelf shows it wasn't. Somebody in between made a decision about where those supplies went. Voss controls receiving authorization. Voss controls receiving authorization. Garrison confirmed. Dex spoke without turning from her screen. He also has a procurement relationship with a contractor called Halverton Medical Supply. They've been Hargrove's secondary vendor for 2 years. Contract was approved by Voss's office and renewed 6 months ago without competitive bidding, which is outside standard protocol for a facility this size, but apparently nobody flagged it. What does Halverton supply? Officially, overflow inventory and specialized equipment. The kind of items that don't move through the primary distributor. Dex paused. Unofficially, we're looking at a pattern of substitution, name brand, clinical equipment swapped for cheaper generic equivalents at full billing rates, with the difference going somewhere that isn't Hargrove's operating budget. Lena looked at the documents on the table. The shape of it was becoming clear. He's been billing the hospital for quality equipment and delivering substandard product, pocketing the margin. That's the financial piece, Garrison said. The part that concerns us more is the tactical piece. The civilian man spoke for the first time. His voice was measured, the kind that had been trained to deliver information without editorializing. Halverton Medical Supply has a subsidiary registration and a holding structure that connects through 3 intermediate entities to an overseas logistics operation we've been monitoring for 14 months. That operation has known ties to the group responsible for the device that injured Rourke. The room was quiet for a moment. So Voss isn't just running a billing scheme, Lena said. Voss may not have known the full scope of what he was connected to, Garrison said. Or he did. We don't have that answer yet. What we have is a financial thread that runs from this hospital's supply budget to people who build devices designed to put operators in medical facilities. Lena leaned back in her chair. The picture was ugly. It's a specific way that things are ugly when they've been hidden inside something ordinary, a hospital supply budget, a contractor relationship, a series of purchase orders. Nothing that would look remarkable to anyone who wasn't looking carefully. She had been looking carefully for 3 years. She had been flagging Slegzing's discrepancies, submitting purchase orders that weren't fulfilled, tracking inventory that didn't match the records. She had thought she was doing her job. She had been, without knowing it, documenting a crime. My purchase order records, she said. The ones I submitted going back 18 months. You need those. Garrison looked at her. You kept them. She pulled the spiral notebook from the pocket of her scrub jacket. She'd grabbed it automatically when Pete walked her out, the same way she grabbed her water bottle and her jacket. Habit. Handwritten, time-stamped, cross-referenced against the inventory system. Every discrepancy I found, every order that wasn't filled, every substitution where the delivered product didn't match the requested spec. She put it on the table. I thought I was building a case for the supply coordinator. The civilian's man reached for it, then stopped and looked at her. Waiting. Take it, she said. He took it. The next problem arrived at 12:47 in the form of a text to Garrison's phone that he read, put down, and picked back up to read again in the space of 4 seconds, which told Lena it was bad before he said anything. Rourke's out of surgery. That's not the problem. No. Garrison set the phone face down on the table. The vascular surgeon who operated Dr. Ferris is reporting that the post-op medication orders in Rourke's chart have already been updated. New orders signed off under Doyle's credentials, modifying the sedation to analgesic balance in a way that Ferris flagged as inconsistent with Rourke's post-surgical status. Lena was on her feet before he finished the sentence. That's the same modification the tech was trying to push through the dispensing station. Yes, Doyle didn't write those orders. Ferris doesn't think so either. The timestamp puts them at 11:53, which is when Doyle was on the phone with administration following the surgical referral. Someone used his credentials. She was already moving toward the door. Those orders process before Ferris can put a hold on them. Ferris has already flagged them for pharmacy review, but pharmacy is running a backlog from this morning's shift change, and she was in the corridor before he finished. Post-surgical ward was on the 4th floor, east wing. Lena took the stairs because the elevator would cost her 30 seconds she didn't have. She came through the stairwell door into the 4th floor corridor and moved toward the nursing station, reading the board as she approached room numbers, patient codes, the dry erase assignment grid that told her which nurse was covering which bay. Rourke was in 412. She went to the nursing station first. The charge nurse, a heavyset woman named Sandra, who had been at Hargrove for 15 years and who Lena knew well enough to have shared a break room coffee with on slow mornings, looked up with the expression of someone who was aware that the woman approaching her had been suspended 4 hours ago. "I know," Lena said, before Sandra could produce the relevant policy. The order's in 412. Sedation modification, signed under Doyle's credentials at 11:53. Has pharmacy processed them? Sandra's expression shifted from procedural concern to something more immediate. They're in the queue. She checked her screen. 3rd in line. 2 items ahead of it. How long? At current pace, 8 to 12 minutes. I need you to call pharmacy right now and put a manual hold on that queue item. Tell them it's flagged for credential verification. I don't have the authority to Sandra. Lena leaned on the counter and looked at her directly. In approximately 8 minutes, that order is going to dispense a medication adjustment to whose cardiovascular status makes it dangerous. The orders were not written by Doyle. Someone used his login. I need you to make that call right now, and I will stand here and take every piece of the administrative fallout for it, but I need you to do it now. Sandra held her gaze for 2 seconds. Then she picked up the phone. Lena was already moving toward 412. Rourke looked smaller in the hospital bed than he had on the trauma table, which was always true of patients post-surgery, the removal of urgency. The stillness, tubes and lines and monitors reducing a person to a set of readings and a body that needed time. He was sedated, which was appropriate. His color was better than it had been 2 hours ago, which was the only positive data point available. The leg was immobilized and elevated, drainage lines running from the wound site into collection bags that showed the expected post-operative output. A nurse Lena didn't recognize was at the IV station. Lena looked at her badge, clip type, lanyard position, staff photo. She didn't recognize the face, but the badge was correct full staff credentials, the right format, the laminate wear pattern of a card that had been used for months. She was adjusting the IV line at the primary port, which was a routine task, which was also exactly the kind of routine task that provided access to the medication delivery system. "What are you adjusting?" Lena asked. The nurse looked up. Young, composed, a little too composed for a ward nurse who had just had a federal team walk through her floor. Routine line check, confirming flow rate. That port doesn't need a flow rate check post-surgery. The rate's set at the pump. Lena moved into the room. Step back from the line. "I'm sorry, who are you?" "You're not on this ward staff." Step back from the line. Something passed across the nurse's face, just a flicker. The kind that happens when a prepared response meets an unexpected variable. Then she reached for the IV port with a motion that was not a flow rate check. Lena caught her wrist, not aggressive, precise. 2 fingers and a thumb around the wrist, firm enough to stop the motion, angled in a way that made completing it mechanically impossible. For escalation, the nurse apparently wasn't prepared to make. The nurse froze. In Lena's other hand was the IV line, which she had pulled from the port with her left hand in the same motion she used to secure the wrist with her right. They stood like that for a moment. "Whatever's in your hand," Lena said quietly, "put it on the tray." A long pause. The nurse opened her fingers. A small, preloaded syringe dropped onto the tray side the IV station. Clear fluid. No label. Lena looked at it, then at the nurse. "Get on the floor. On your knees, hands visible." The nurse didn't move. "Now." She went down. Garrison's team was in the room 40 seconds later, which meant they'd been closer than Lena had realized, and the nurse, who turned out to have valid Hargrove credentials that had been issued 6 weeks ago through a personnel request originating in Voss's office, under a hire that the nursing director had no record of approving, was removed from the room without incident. Lena reconnected the IV line, checked the pump settings, checked the monitoring leads. Her hands were steady. They were always steady. That had never felt like a virtue so much as a fact of her particular construction. But right now she was grateful for it, because the alternative was hands that shook over a sedated man who had almost been killed twice in the same day. Stood at the bedside for a moment. Rourke's chest rose and fell. The monitor showed a heart rate of 62, which was reasonable. He didn't know any of this was happening. He wouldn't know until he woke up, and by then it would be a story someone else would tell him. She checked the drainage lines one more time. Habit, thoroughness, the thing her hands did when her brain needed a moment to catch up to what had just occurred, and then she stepped back and let the floor nurse, who was now actually Sandra from the charge station, take over monitoring. Garrison was waiting in the corridor. "The syringe," Lena said, "bagged and labeled. We'll have a composition analysis within the hour, but the preload format and concentration markers are consistent with what the dispensing system was being asked to authorize this morning." He paused. 2 attempts on the same patient, same method, 2 different vectors. Someone wanted to be sure, someone with enough facility access to provision a pharmacy tech credential and a nursing hire through Voss's office. Yes, that's not a contractor relationship. That's embedded access. She looked down the corridor. How long has this been in place? We don't know yet. The Halverton connection goes back 2 years, to when the contract was first approved. The personnel records we've pulled so far show at least 3 hires in the last 18 months that trace back to the same HR request pathway, all approved at the administrative level. None of them flagged by clinical supervisors because their credentials were procedurally valid. Lena thought about that. 3 hires, 18 months. People moving through this hospital with legitimate-looking badges, learning its rhythms, its shift patterns, which corridors were watched and which weren't, how the pharmacy queue worked and when it ran behind. They've been building infrastructure here, she said. This wasn't reactive. They weren't responding to Rourke's injury. They had assets in place before he arrived. That's our assessment, yes. Which means they knew he was coming. Or they knew someone was coming. Garrison's jaw shifted. Or they built infrastructure here, specifically, because this facility was on our extraction route. Which means someone knew our operational parameters for this region. The hallway felt colder than it had a moment ago. Not temperature. Something else. Garrison. She chose her words carefully. They had assets in place here before Rourke arrived, and if the device was designed to route him to a medical facility, and if Halverton's connection to your monitoring target goes back 14 months, she stopped. He finished it. Then the possibility exists that the operation wasn't designed to kill him in the field. It was designed to get him here. They looked at each other. Who knew the extraction route parameters? She asked. That's a very short list. And is everyone on that list currently accounted for? He didn't answer immediately, which was its own answer. Dex appeared at the stairwell door, Garrison. Her voice had the flat urgency of someone delivering information they wished they didn't have. Voss isn't in his office. His car is still in the structure, but his phone is pinging from the East Wing service corridor, which is off camera. And we just lost visual on the third member of the Halverton team. We identified the one we hadn't interdicted yet. Last confirmed position was second floor administrative. Lena looked at Garrison. How many of them are still in this building? At least one unaccounted for, Dex said. Possibly two. And Voss is moving through a corridor with no camera coverage, Lena said, which he knows the layout of because he's managed this building for 7 years. She looked at the door to 412. Rourke was in there, post-surgical, sedated, with 2 failed attempts on his life already logged and one more unaccounted for asset somewhere in the building. You need more people on that room. I've got 2 outside the door. You need more. We're working with what we deployed. I wasn't planning for a 3-vector. Then call it in. She said it without heat, but without room in it either. Call in whatever you need and do it in the next 3 minutes, because if Voss is moving through that service corridor, he's not going to his car. Garrison was already on the radio. Lena turned toward the East Wing. Where are you going? Dex asked. Service corridor. East Wing. You don't have a weapon? No. She pushed through the door. But I know this building better than he does. The East Wing service corridor was the kind of space that existed in every large hospital, and that most clinical staff never needed to enter a utilitarian artery running parallel to the patient-facing hallways, used by facilities, teams, and housekeeping, and the people who moved equipment between departments without rolling it through areas where patients and visitors would see it. Bare concrete, exposed conduit, overhead fluorescence on a motion sensor circuit that clicked on in sections as she moved through. She had been in this corridor more times than she could count. It ran the length of the East Wing on all 4 floors connected to the service elevator and had 2 exits to the parking structure and 1 to the loading dock at the rear of the building. Voss would know those exits. She moved without running in a service corridor, made noise that carried, and she worked through the likely logic of where he was going and why. He wasn't fleeing. His car was still in the structure. If he were fleeing, he'd have taken it 2 hours ago when the federal team first walked through his door. He was moving because something in his plan had broken down, and he was trying to reach something or someone before the remaining pieces failed. She hit the second-floor junction and stopped, listened. Fluorescence in the section ahead had triggered not by her because she hadn't moved that direction. Something else had activated the sensor, something moving away from her toward the south junction where the corridor connected to the old equipment storage wing, which was the one part of the East Wing service corridor that didn't have a direct camera coverage gap because it didn't have cameras at all. The equipment storage wing had been decommissioned 18 months ago. Dark, offline, and connected via a maintenance passage to the substructure below the loading dock. She moved toward the triggered fluorescence. The storage wing door was slightly open. Not forced, the magnetic lock had been released by a keycard, which meant Voss still had his credentials, which meant the access lockdown Garrison had requested hadn't processed yet through the facility system, which meant that the 7 minutes it took Hargrove's IT department to act an emergency credential revocation was exactly the window someone with institutional knowledge would count on. She pushed the door open with her shoulder, keeping her hands clear. Storage wing was dim emergency strip, lighting at floor level, equipment shrouded under dusty covers, the particular stale cold of a space that had been climate controlled and then wasn't. She let her eyes adjust. A sound from the far end. Not movement voices. Low, one of them clipped and tense, the other shorter, responding in under a second. She moved toward them along the wall. using the shrouded equipment for cover. Not because she was invisible, she wasn't. This wasn't a tactical environment. She was a woman in a faded scrub top, without so much as a radio, but because reaching them, without announcing her presence, first gave her information before it gave them a decision. She got close enough to hear. Voss was on a phone. His back was to her. He was talking in the tight, controlled register of someone who was scared and trying not to sound like it. Both vectors failed. I need extraction. I'm telling you the window is a pause. I understand that. I understand. But if they pull my records, the Halverton documentation is going to... Another pause. Longer. No, that's not acceptable. You told me this was clean. You told me the operational risk to the facility was minus... He stopped. He had heard something, or felt something, that specific shift in ambient presence, that a person registers in a quiet, enclosed space when the number of people in it changes. He turned. He looked at Lena. She was 12 feet away, standing in the emergency strip lighting, with her hands visible at her sides. They looked at each other. Voss was pale, his jacket pulled slightly wrong at the shoulder, a sheen at his hairline that was not the temperature of the room. Still had the phone in his hand. On the other end of it, someone was speaking. She could hear the tinny output of a voice, too small to make out, and Voss was not responding to it because he was looking at the woman he had signed off on some spending 4 hours ago, who was now standing between him and the exit. Put the phone on the equipment behind you, Lena said. He didn't move. Mr. Voss. The phone. You have no authority here. His voice was finding something to hold on to the administrative register that had worked in his office all morning. You're a suspended employee who has been trespassing in a restricted. There have been 2 attempts on a patient's life in the last 3 hours using assets that were credentialed through your office. There's a preloaded syringe in an evidence bag on the 4th floor. There's a pharmacy tech in federal custody. There are procurement records connecting your office to a supply contractor with ties to an overseas operation that built the device that put that patient in this hospital. She said it, the same way she said everything without performance. The phone, please. Something moved through Voss's expression. Not remorse. Not the specific collapse of someone who has been caught. Something harder than that, the look of a man who had believed he was managing a risk and had just realized the risk was larger than he'd been told. I didn't know about the device, he said. I believe you. Didn't know they were going to. He stopped, swallowed. It was a supply contract, a financial arrangement. I didn't know it connected to put the phone on the equipment behind you. Then don't move. She kept her eyes on him. I'm not the one you need to explain this to. Turned and placed the phone on the covered equipment behind him. And then the lights went out. Not the emergency strips, those stayed on. The floor-level orange glow that turned everything into flat planes and deep shadow. The overhead fluorescence. The whole corridor section. Not a motion sensor timeout. The motion sensors had a 3-minute delay, and she'd been moving. This was a cut, deliberate, targeted. The kind that required access to the facility's electrical management system, which was accessible from the building automation terminal in the sub-level mechanical room. The third unaccounted-for asset. In the orange emergency glow, Voss was a silhouette near the covered equipment. She could see him. She could see the door behind her, slightly open, the pale light of the surface corridor beyond it. What she could not immediately see was where the sound was coming from a footstep. One from somewhere to her left, among the covered equipment, careful and deliberate, placed by someone who knew exactly how to move in low light. She had trained for this. She had spent years in rooms darker than this, with higher stakes, and the part of her that Hargrove Regional Medical Center had never known about, the part that pushed a supply cart through the basement and filed purchase orders and kept her head down and tried very hard to be. Unremarkable, that part had always been the smaller part. She moved left, fast and low, putting covered equipment between herself and the sound. Behind her, Voss made a noise that was not quite a word. And then somewhere in the darkness of the decommissioned storage wing, something metallic struck the concrete floor, and a male voice said something sharp and involuntary. And the emergency strip lighting threw his shadow across the wall long before Lena saw the man himself, and she already knew, from the shadow's posture and the angle of his arm, exactly what he was holding and exactly how much time she had before he decided what to do with it. She already knew, from the shadow's posture and the angle of his arm, exactly how much time she had and exactly how much time she had before he decided what to do with it. Not much. She dropped behind the nearest covered equipment, something large and boxy under a canvas tarp, an old imaging unit by the shape of it, and moved along its length in the dark without standing up. The emergency strips gave her enough light to read the floor, but not the space above height, which meant she had the same visibility problem he did. And the question was, who had trained longer for that particular disadvantage? She had trained longer. The footstep came again, her left, 2 o'clock, from her original position, moving to cut off the door. He was trying to get between her and the exit, which was tactically correct, and also told her something. He didn't know exactly where she was. If he'd had a clear sightline, he'd have moved differently. He was working from the sound of her last position. She stayed still. Voss, to his credit, or possibly just his terror, had not moved or spoken since the lights went out. He was somewhere behind her, motionless, which was the most useful thing he had done all day. Footsteps stopped. Listening. She was listening too. Breathing through her nose, shallow, the way you do when the ambient noise needs to be as low as possible. Storage wing was not silent. There was the distant hum of the building's mechanical systems, the faint sound of the service corridor through the partly open door, her own pulse, which she was actively declining to pay attention to. Then she heard it. Not a footstep. A shift in weight, the specific creak of a person's balance moving from one foot to the other, approximately 8 feet to her left, slightly behind the position she'd estimated. She picked up the only thing within reach that she could use, a metal IV pole that had been propped against the imaging unit under the tarp, old model, heavy at the base. Felt it with her left hand while she was moving, and registered it without stopping. Pulled it toward her now, slow and controlled, and the tarp shifted with a dry whisper that she couldn't prevent. He heard it. He moved toward her fast, committed, the way you move when you've given up the position game and decided forward momentum was the better option. She heard him coming and made the only decision available. She stood up and swung the IV pole lateral and low, aiming for where his legs would be at his current trajectory and pace. She connected. Not cleanly, she caught the side of his knee rather than a full shin strike, and the pole rang against something hard, maybe a kneecap, maybe a shin guard, and he went down partly rather than completely, one knee on the concrete, and the sound he made was short and surprised rather than incapacitated. But he was down, and she was already moving past him toward the door. Not because she was running, but because there was nothing in this room she needed to win except the 30 seconds it would take Garrison's team to reach her position. She hit the door with her shoulder, came through into the service corridor, and pulled it shut behind her. Wing storage, sublevel 2 junction, she said to the empty corridor, loudly and clearly, because Garrison's team had put a comms unit on the second floor and sound carried in concrete corridors. One man down inside, possibly armed. Voss is in there. Come. Now. She stood with her back against the door and felt her heart rate doing what it was going to do, regardless of what she told it. And she let it, because the situation had resolved enough that her body was allowed to have an opinion. The door shifted against her back weight applied from the other side, testing it. She braced. 20 seconds later, she heard footsteps from the north junction. Running. 2 sets, then a third. They took both men out of the storage wing without significant incident, which was not the same as without difficulty the armed man, who turned out to have a ceramic plate under his maintenance coveralls that had absorbed most of the IV all pole strike. was resistant enough to require 2 members of Garrison's team and left one of them with a split lip and a torn jacket. Voss walked out on his own, hands up, which was probably the first unambiguously correct decision he had made all day. Garrison looked at Lena in the service corridor light. He looked at the IV pole she was still holding, then at her hands, then at her face. You went in there without a radio. I know. Or backup. I know that too. He seemed to be working through something. Are you hurt? She checked. Genuinely the kind of internal inventory that takes 2 seconds and doesn't require drama. Her left shoulder had caught the door on the way through and would bruise. Her right knee had impacted the corner of the imaging unit at some point she hadn't fully registered during the movement. Nothing structural. No. Garrison took the IV pole from her, not urgently, just removing it from the equation. Next time you decide to go into a dark room after a man with an unknown weapon, tell someone first. There wasn't time for the full briefing. A text takes 4 seconds. She almost said something. Decided not to. He wasn't wrong, and she was tired enough that arguing with correct information felt like a waste of resources she wanted back. The federal documentation processing that followed was, in its own way, as exhausting as everything that had preceded it, not physically, but in the grinding, methodical way of things that matter and that move at the pace institutions require rather than the pace situations mains demand. Garrison's team worked fast by the standards of the process, but the process was still the process. Chain of custody for the syringe and the tablet, formal statements, access log pulls, the credential revocation that had finally processed at some point during the storage wing incident, and was now largely academic. Lena gave her statement in the second-floor conference room, sitting across from the civilian man who still hadn't introduced himself, and she spoke for 40 minutes in the direct, detailed way she had once been trained to report, and which she had spent 3 years not using. Took notes. He didn't interrupt except to clarify sequence. When she finished, he looked at his notes for a moment. The purchase order records in the notebook, he said. 18 months of discrepancy documentation. Yes, you maintained those independently, not in the hospital system. The hospital system would have shown me whatever Voss wanted it to show me. Kept my own. He nodded slowly. Those records are going to be significant. The Halverton paper trail has gaps that your documentation fills. She absorbed that. 18 months of meticulous, handwritten inventory records that she had kept because she was doing her job correctly, and because she was, by nature, someone who documented things, turned out to be the connective tissue in a federal investigation into supply fraud and material support to a foreign-linked operational network. She had filed those purchase orders and tracked those discrepancies because that was what her job required. Because she took her job seriously in a building full of people who had told her repeatedly that her job was beneath serious consideration. She did not say any of that out loud, but she thought about it sitting in that conference room while the civilian man organized his notes. Doyle found her in the 4th floor corridor outside Rourke's room at 3:40 in the afternoon. She was sitting in one of the 2 chairs that had been pulled into the hallway for Garrison's posted personnel, who were both currently inside 412 for a monitoring rotation. She was drinking water from her insulated bottle, and looking at nothing in particular, which was not the same as thinking about nothing. Her right knee ached in the specific way that said the morning would be worse, and she was deciding whether she cared. Doyle stopped in front of her. He looked different from this morning. Not physically, he was wearing the same clothes, same hair, same build, but something in the way he was carrying himself had changed. The width of the stride was the same, the posture was the same, but something behind it was gone, and the absence of it made him look, oddly, more like a person. He stood there for a moment without saying anything. Lena waited. "The order's under my credentials," he said finally. "I've given my statement to the federal team. I want you to know that I know you didn't write them, she said. He seemed to have been prepared for more resistance than that, and the absence of it knocked him slightly off whatever he had prepared to say next. Stood there. Ferris flagged them because the protocol was wrong, Lena said. You don't modify sedation to analgesic ratios in a patient with that blood loss profile at 3 hours post-op. Anyone who actually runs trauma would know that. So the orders were either written by someone who didn't know what they were doing or by someone who knew exactly what they were doing and what the physiological consequence would be. Either way, it wasn't you. Doyle looked at the floor. I should have approved the restock order. She didn't say anything. February order, and the one before it. I had them flagged on my desk and he stopped. Started again. Voss told me the shortages were a delivery timing issue, and I didn't push back because it wasn't my department and I had other priorities, and He stopped again. I didn't look at it closely enough. No, she said. You didn't. If I had, the morning case might have gone differently. Patient in Bay 1, she said it, without cruelty, but without softening it either. He had asked for the accounting, and she was giving it to him straight. Possibly. Or the shortage would have continued through other means, because the supply chain itself was compromised. We don't know. He nodded. It was a different kind of nod than the one she had seen from him this morning. Not the nod of someone deciding something, but of someone receiving something they'd rather not have to hold. You were right this morning, he said. About the restock. About all of it. Yes. He looked up. Something in his expression that she didn't have a precise name for, not shame exactly. More like the specific discomfort of a person who has just accurately located themselves. I was wrong about you. She looked at him for a moment. You made a lot of assumptions about what I was worth based on what I was doing, she said. Most people here did. That's not unusual, and I'm not going to pretend it didn't affect things, because it did. It affected the stocking levels, and it affected the morning case, and it affected the fact that I was in a parking lot with a cardboard box when Rourke arrived instead of inside this building. She paused. But I'm more interested in what happens next than in the accounting of this morning. He nodded again. Then he turned and walked back toward the elevator, and his stride was the same width it always was, but it carried something different in it, something heavier, more considered. The way the person walks when they've just been made to understand that the ground they've been standing on has more weight to it than they'd accounted for. She watched him go, and then went back to her water bottle. Forceful findings began to emerge in the hours that followed, in the piecemeal way that investigations produce information, not in a clean reveal, but in increments, each one adding resolution to a picture that had started as a blur and was becoming, gradually, specific. Halverton Medical Supply had been billing Hargrove Regional for premium clinical equipment and delivering generic equivalents at a margin difference of between 38 and 60 and 62%, depending on product category. Over 26 months of the contract, the total financial variance was just under $2.3 million. Voss had been routing the difference through a series of approval layers that looked from inside the hospital's accounting system. Like standard vendor credit adjustments. Connection between Halverton's parent holding structure and the overseas logistics operation was 14 months old in the federal monitoring record, but the operational relationship was older than that. The civilian man estimated the actual establishment of the network at closer to 3 years, which meant the Halverton contract at Hargrove had been built deliberately, not opportunistically. The facility had been selected. Voss had been identified and cultivated. Whether Voss had understood the full nature of what he was connected to was still an open question, but the answer was becoming less relevant as the documentation continued to emerge. The specific question of whether he knew the device that injured Rourke was designed to route the patient to a compromised medical facility was one that his own attorney, who arrived at 5 in the afternoon, immediately advised him not to answer. Doyle's falsified credential use was confirmed as external someone had accessed his login through the hospital's remote physician portal using credentials obtained through the personnel system, which connected back to one of the three hires Dex had identified. The nursing hire, who had entered Rourke's room with the preloaded syringe, was identified as the source of the portal access. Her actual identity, distinct from the credentials she'd been using, was something the federal team was still running when Lina left the building that evening. Pharmacy tech was talking. He had been, apparently, since approximately 30 minutes after his interdiction, in the stairwell, which suggested his commitment to the operation had been primarily financial and had a clear breaking point. He named Voss directly. He described the arrangement in terms that were not exculpatory for either of them. And he provided, in the course of his statement, a detail that neither Garrison's team nor Lina had yet surfaced. Voss had been told, 2 days before Rourke's injury, that an extraction route operator would likely be routed through Hargrove following an engagement in the region. He had been given a name, not Rourke's name, a different name. The original target had been a different operator. Rourke had been injured instead because the field situation had changed and the device had been activated against whoever was in the vehicle, which meant the network had known 2 days in advance which vehicle that was. Garrison received this information at 6:12 in the evening and spent approximately 90 seconds very still in the conference room before he picked up his phone and made a call that lasted 4 minutes and that Lina, who was still present, heard enough of to understand the implications. Operational security breach had not originated at Hargrove. It had originated upstream. She watched his face while he was on the phone, and she thought about the short list of people who had known the extraction route parameters, which he had declined to name that afternoon. And she thought about how a network that had been building infrastructure in a specific medical facility for 2 years would only do so if they had reliable intelligence about which facilities were on active operational extraction routes. And reliable intelligence of that specificity came from a very particular kind of access. Garrison ended the call and put his phone face down on the table. The civilian man was already on a separate line. Dex was typing. Lina sat across the room and said nothing, because there was nothing useful for her to say. At this particular moment, and she had learned a long time ago the difference between the moments that required her and the moments that required her to be quiet and let other people do their part. This was the second kind. At 7:20 that evening, Hargrove Regional Medical Center had 3 fewer employees than it had started the day with, a 4th-floor room under federal protective detail, an acting administrator who had been the deputy director of operations and who had spent most of the afternoon looking like someone doing math they hadn't expected to be asked to do, and a trauma unit that was operating on the 11 large-bore vascular access kits that Lina had warned them about in February. Emergency purchase order for 32 units had been submitted at 6 o'clock. It had been approved in 11 minutes. Lina was in central supply, not because anyone had officially reinstated her, the administrative suspension still technically in place, a bureaucratic reality that nobody in the building had prioritized resolving amid everything else. But the supply room was unlocked. The keycard restriction had lapsed when the facility system was reset following the electrical management incident, and there was an inventory that hadn't been properly audited in at least 18 months. She had her notebook. She had her phone. She had the spare pen she kept in the breast pocket of her scrub top. She started from the top shelf and worked down. The work was familiar in the way that necessary, unglamorous things are familiar, not comforting exactly, but grounding. She moved through the shelving with the methodical attention that had always characterized the way she did this, checking levels against records, flagging discrepancies, making notes. The gap between what the system showed and what was actually on the shelf was, in several categories, significant. Not just the vascular access kits, surgical drainage supplies, specific catheter types, a category of wound care materials that the trauma unit used heavily and that the record showed fully stocked and the shelf showed at roughly 40% of that. She wrote it all down. The door to central supply opened at 7:53. She heard it, but didn't turn around immediately. She was mid-shelf, and whatever it was could wait 3 seconds. Pruitt, she turned. It was Sandra, the charge nurse from the 4th floor, still in her scrubs from a shift that had been significantly longer than anyone had planned for when it started. She was carrying 2 coffees from the staff room, and she held one out. Lena took it. "How's your floor?" she asked. Quieter. Sandra leaned against the doorframe. "Rourke stable. Ferris thinks the leg is going to be functional." "Not what it was, but functional." She paused. "The nurses are talking." "Imagine they are. About this morning. About what happened with you and Doyle and all of it." Sandra looked at her coffee. "A lot of them feel bad about not saying anything. When Doyle went after you in the corridor," Lena pulled a tray of suture kits forward and checked the expiration dates. 2 of them were past the discard threshold. She set them aside. "They weren't the ones going after me." "Still." Sandra was quiet for a moment. "Been down here 3 years, and none of us asked. What you did before. Where you came from. I didn't advertise it." "No, but we should have asked." She said it simply, not as a performance of guilt. Just a statement of fact, the way you acknowledge an omission that you can't retroactively correct, but can at least accurately name. Lena looked at her. Sandra was not a person who said things for effect. It was one of the things she had always quietly appreciated about her. In the marginal, unspoken way you appreciate people you work near without ever being close to. "I'm going to need help with the full inventory." "Audit," Lena said. "When you have staff to spare. The discrepancies go back further than today." Sandra nodded. "I'll find you people." She pushed off from the doorframe. "Drink the coffee before it's cold." She left. Lena looked at the coffee for a moment, then set it on the shelf beside her notebook and kept working. At 8:47, Garrison came down to Central Supply. He stood in the doorway, the way he'd stood at the emergency entrance that morning, taking in the space, reading it, the kind of attention that didn't advertise itself. Then he came in and stood near the shelf she was working on, and she waited for him to say whatever he'd come to say. "Voss's attorney is pushing for a cooperations agreement," he said, "which means his statement is going to be more complete than it would otherwise be." "Good. The network access question, the upstream breach, is going to take longer. That's outside what we're working here. I understand." He looked at the shelf she was auditing. The notebook, the flagged items, the systematic progress of someone who had apparently decided to do a complete inventory of a hospital supply room at 8 o'clock in the evening. "You know you're still technically suspended." "I know. The acting administrator is going to want to address that." "He can address it tomorrow morning." She moved the tray of flagged suture kits to the discard bin. Tonight I have 18 months of inventory discrepancies to document." Garrison was quiet for a moment. "The notebook you handed over this afternoon," he said. "The 18 months of purchase orders and discrepancy records. Those records are the backbone of the financial case against Voss and Halverton. Without them, we have the criminal conduct, but we have holes in the documentation that would have taken weeks to fill." She didn't say anything. "You kept those records because it was your job," he said. "Yes. You kept them for 18 months in a building where nobody thought your job was worth taking seriously." She looked at him. "Are you making a point or asking a question?" Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile. "Something quieter than that. Rourke is going to want to meet you when he's awake enough for it to mean something. He doesn't owe me anything. He knows that. He'll want to anyway." Garrison straightened. "I'll be here through tomorrow morning. After that. The federal case handlers take it from this point." "Okay." He moved toward the door, then stopped. "For what it's worth, and I recognize it's a limited sample, you're the same person you were when you left." Whatever you thought you'd lost. She looked at him. He left before she could figure out whether she wanted to respond to that, which she suspected was intentional. She stood in the supply room for a moment with her pen in her hand and her notebook open to a half-completed page of inventory discrepancies, and she thought about what he'd said, and then she decided that thinking about it could wait until she'd finished the current shelf. She picked up the next tray. The acting administrator, a careful man named Robert Feld, who had spent 7 years as Voss's deputy, and who had spent most of this particular day trying to understand how thoroughly he had misread. His own workplace came to find her at 9:15. He came alone, without the HR coordinator or the hospital's legal counsel, which was either naive or deliberate. She gave him the benefit of the doubt and assumed deliberate, stood in the doorway. "I'd like to formally lift the suspension," he said. "Effective now, if that works for you." She set down the inventory tray she was holding. "It works for me. Your badge will be reissued tomorrow morning. I'll have your access credentials restored tonight." He paused. "I also want to say, on behalf of the administration, what Dr. Doyle said to you this morning and the way the suspension was handled, and the fact that your inventory concerns were not addressed for 18 months. Mr. Feld," he stopped. "Write it in the record," she said, formally. "Everything that was done incorrectly, why it was done, and the correct process going forward. Write it so it's documented and reviewable." She looked at him steadily. "That's worth more to this facility than what you were about to say." He looked at her for a moment. "All right," he said. "I will." He turned to go, then stopped with his hand on the doorframe. "Dr. Doyle is on administrative review pending the credential investigation, separate from the federal matter internal process. I don't know what the outcome will be. Neither do I." "Do you have an opinion on it?" She considered. "He's a competent surgeon who made administrative decisions based on bad information and didn't look closely enough at where that information was coming from. The internal review process should make that determination. I don't need to make it for them." Feld nodded. And then, in the doorway of a hospital supply room at 9:15 on a day that had begun with Lena Pruitt carrying a cardboard box through a parking lot, he said, "We're glad you came back in." Picked up the next tray. "I almost didn't," she said. He left. She worked for another 20 minutes in silence, methodical and unhurried, and she was halfway through the last section of shelving when she found it tucked behind a supply of outdated wound irrigation kits, pushed to the back of the shelf in a way that was not consistent with how she organized the room and had therefore not been there when she last audited this section in January. A small cardboard box, sealed, with a Halverton Medical Supply shipping label. Unlogged. No receiving documentation. No inventory entry. She did not touch it. She stepped back from the shelf and looked at it. Then she pulled out her phone and called Garrison, and when he picked up, she said, quietly and without drama, "I need you in Central Supply. Bring Dex and whoever's running evidence. And bring gloves." Pause. "How many?" She looked at the box, at the label, the shelf around it, which she now realized she needed to look at more carefully, because if there was one unlogged Halverton shipment pushed to the back of her supply room, there was no reason to assume it was the only one. And if the network had been building infrastructure in this facility for 2 years, and if Voss had been their access point into the procurement system, then the question was not just what was in this box, but the question was what else had been moved through her room without her knowledge. In a hospital that had been treating patients every day for 18 months. "Garrison," she said, "just come now." She stayed exactly where she was while she waited, not touching the shelf, not moving the box, not disturbing anything around it. That was the first thing you learned about evidence. The instinct to handle it was strong and almost always wrong. She stood with her hands at her sides and looked at the Halverton label and thought about the 18 months she had spent in this room, the hours she had logged here, the careful system she had built and maintained and defended against administrative indifference. She thought about the fact that someone had used her room, her organized, methodical, precisely maintained room, as a storage point for something she hadn't known was there. That feeling was not anger, exactly. It was closer to the specific sensation of finding out that the ground you'd been standing on had a different composition than you'd believed. Not collapsed, just different. Fundamentally, quietly different. And the difference mattered, professional in ways she was only beginning to calculate. Garrison's arrived in 4 minutes with Dex and a federal evidence technician. She hadn't met a woman in her 30s named Calloway, with a field kit and the focused efficiency of someone pulled from another assignment who was not going to let that affect her work. They gloved up at the door without being told. Calloway photographed the shelf from 4 angles before anyone touched anything, then carefully extracted the box and set it on the central supply work table under the overhead light. It was not a large box. Its dimensions were consistent with standard medical supply packaging, the kind that moved through hospital receiving without attracting attention, because it looked exactly like everything else that moved through hospital receiving. The Halverton label carried a product code that didn't correspond to anything in Hargrove's inventory catalog, which Lena confirmed by checking the system on her phone while Calloway worked the seal. That code doesn't exist in our catalog, she said. It exists in Halverton's, Dex said, reading from her tablet. Listed as a specialty diagnostic component, restricted distribution. Calloway cut the seal and opened the box. Insides, packed in standard medical foam with the kind of care that suggested the contents were both valuable and fragile, were 6 identical devices, rectangular, matte gray, each roughly the size of a paperback book, with a port configuration that Lena didn't recognize from any clinical equipment she'd worked with in 3 years. At this facility, or in the years before it. Garrison looked at them without touching, his jaw set. Telemetry override units, he said. It wasn't a question. The civilian man who had followed Garrison down from the 2nd floor without being asked, which Lena was starting to understand, was simply how he operated, stood at the edge of the work table, designed to interface with hospital monitoring systems. They can suppress alarm thresholds, generate false stable readings, or mask physiological deterioration in a way that looks, in the system record, like a stable patient. Lena looked at the 6 devices in their foam pockets and thought about Rourke in room 412, 3 floors above her. 4 days post-surgery, chest rising, and falling under a monitoring system that someone had apparently planned to compromise. The medication adjustment through the dispensing system was one approach, she said. These were the backup. If the first vector was interdicted, Garrison said, someone with room access attaches one of these to the monitoring interface, and the clinical picture looks normal right up until it isn't. He looked at her. 2 independent, redundant systems, both requiring internal facility access, both requiring someone who understood hospital monitoring well enough to deploy them, without triggering immediate suspicion. This wasn't built in a day, she said. No. He looked at the devices. The operational planning for this facility goes back well before Rourke's injury. The question is, how far back? She looked around the room, her room, which she had inherited and organized and audited and considered her domain for 3 years. Sweep the rest of it, she said to Calloway. Every shelf, every storage unit, everything that's been pushed to the back or stored below the standard site line. I want to know what else is in here that isn't in my records. Calloway looked at Garrison. He nodded once. They spent the next 2 hours doing exactly that. There were no additional devices. There were, however, 3 more unlogged Halverton shipments, 2 in the far overflow cabinet, and 1 tucked behind a full pallet of saline bags near the loading dock access, positioned low enough that a person doing a standard visual check would register the saline and not look further. All 3 contained materials. 2 held The generic-grade clinical equipment that the Halverton substitution scheme had been cycling through the facility in place of the premium products it billed for. The third held something different, a physical ledger, printed and bound, with handwritten annotations in margins that looked at first glance like internal administrative paperwork and at second glance like nothing Hargrove Regional had ever produced. The civilian man took one look at it through the evidence bag and made a phone call that lasted 6 minutes. He conducted in the corridor outside the supply room door, speaking quietly, and when he came back his expression was the same as it always was, but his pace was slightly different. "The ledger is significant," he said to Garrison, not to Lena, and then, apparently reconsidering, looked at her directly. "The financial documentation in it fills gaps in the upstream case that we've been working around for 8 months. The dating puts it at 14 months old minimum, which means it predates Voss's consolidated involvement with Halverton by at least 6 months. Someone else used this room," Lena said. "Someone with access to this room before Voss was managing the procurement relationship. Previous supply manager left the position 8 months before you arrived. There was a gap year. She had known there was a gap year. She had known it in the administrative sense the position had been vacant, covered by rotating staff, but she had not known what it meant in this context. And knowing it now changed the shape of 3 years of her life in a way that she needed to sit with later, when there was time to sit with things. I need the access logs for this room, going back to the beginning of that gap year," she said. "Already requested," Garrison said. She nodded and looked at the evidence laid out on her work table, the devices, the substituted supplies, the ledger, and she felt, underneath everything else she was feeling, something that was not quite satisfaction but was adjacent to it. The specific weight of a thing that has been hidden for a long time finally having its actual mass because recognized. She had been documenting discrepancies in this room for 18 months. She had filed purchase orders that weren't approved, flagged shortages that were dismissed, submitted written reports that were redirected or ignored or used against her. She had done all of that because it was her job, because she was someone who took her job seriously, and because the discrepancies were real, regardless of whether anyone wanted to hear about them. She had been right the entire time. She had been right and alone in being right, and the people responsible for ensuring she wasn't alone had told her to stop talking. She didn't say any of that out loud. But she thought it, standing in her supply room at 10 o'clock at night, and she let herself think it clearly, and without apology, because some things deserve to be acknowledged, even if only by the person they happened to. The formal findings emerged over the following weeks, in the careful, sequential language of federal investigations, not in a single clean reveal, but in increments, each one adding resolution to a picture that had started as noise and was becoming, piece by piece, a specific and documented account of what had been built inside Hargrove Regional Medical Center and why. Martin Voss was charged on 6 counts: procurement fraud, criminal conspiracy, facilitation of unauthorized access to federal personnel records, material support to a network engaged in activities harmful to federal operators, obstruction and falsification of institutional records. His attorney entered a cooperation request within 72 hours of his arrest. Cooperation produced a detailed statement, which produced additional documentation, which closed several evidentiary gaps that the federal case evidentiary gaps set had been working around. Cooperation agreement reduced the charge set. It did not eliminate it. Sentencing? His attorney argued that Voss had not understood the full scope of the network he had been connected to, that, from his position, it had looked like a financial arrangement with a medical supply contractor, and that the downstream connections to the overseas logistics operation had been deliberate, who had cultivated the relationship. The prosecuting attorney acknowledged the argument and then presented the ledger found in Central Supply, the procurement records, the 3 non-staff credentials provisioned through Voss's office, and the testimony of the pharmacy tech, who had stated plainly that Voss had been told 2 days before Rourke's injury to expect a federal operator to be routed through the facility. Voss had known enough to stop. He had chosen not to stop. The jury took 11 hours. He was convicted on 5 of 6 counts. Lena was not in the courtroom for the verdict. She was at work. She heard about it from Sandra, who texted her a single line at 2:40 in the afternoon. 5 counts. Thought you should know first. She read the text, set her phone back on the shelf, and finished the restock she was in the middle of. Then she picked the phone up again and typed back, "Thank you." That was all. That was enough. Callum Doyle's internal review concluded 43 days after the events of that Tuesday in March. The review board, 3 physicians from outside the facility, 1 nursing representative, 1 administrative representative, found that Doyle had not participated in the fraud, had not known his credentials were being accessed remotely, had not acted with intent to harm any patient. On those 3 points, the record was clear. The board also found that his handling of the supply escalation issue, specifically his public dismissal of Lena's inventory warnings, his decision to blame a support staff member for a clinical problem that originated in his own failure to act on documented concerns, and his conduct during the corridor confrontation on the morning of the incident constituted a material failure of professional responsibility that fell below the standard required of an attending physician in a unit leadership role. His hospital privileges were suspended for 60 days. Mandatory professional conduct review. Mandatory medical leadership training, including a module on supply chain accountability and clinical risk documentation. Return to practice conditional on satisfactory completion of both. He completed them. He came back to the trauma unit on a Monday morning in late spring, quieter than he had been, before not diminished, not broken, but carrying something he hadn't carried when he left. The nurses who worked with him regularly noticed that he read the supply shortage flags now, responded to them within 48 hours, had not once, in the months following his return, publicly redirected blame toward a support staff member for a clinical problem. Could change. Lena had always known that. She had not always found it likely, but she had never stopped knowing it was possible, and she thought that the distinction between those 2 things mattered more than most people gave it credit for. She crossed paths with him in the 3rd-floor corridor one afternoon, about 6 weeks after his return. He was coming out of the trauma unit. She was coming from the elevator with a restock cart. They met at the junction, and both of them stopped because the corridor was narrow and the cart required navigation. He looked at her. She waited. "The February order," he said. "I've thought about it a lot. The one you flagged and I dismissed. I know. If I had acted on it. We don't know what would have happened," she said. Supply chain was compromised at the source. Voss was redirecting fulfilled orders. Even if you'd approved it and pushed for delivery, the product might not have arrived in the form it was supposed to. She adjusted the cart. "What we know is that you dismissed a documented concern without investigation. That's the part that's yours." He held her gaze. "Yes." "And you know it now?" "Yes." She moved the cart past him. "Then that's where it starts." She didn't look back. But she heard him stand there for a moment before he walked on, and she thought that the weight of what he was carrying, now the actual earned weight of having seen himself accurately, was probably more instructive than anything a formal review board could have assigned him. Some lessons required the full consequence to land before they stuck. That was not a comfortable truth, but it was a consistent one. Rourke woke up fully on the 4th day and asked for her by name, which Garrison relayed with the matter-of-fact efficiency he applied to everything. She went up to 412 that afternoon between shifts. The protective detail had reduced to 1. The room was quieter than it had been, monitors running at a calm register, the morning's clinical traffic already concluded. Rourke was propped up in the bed, oriented moving with the careful economy whose body had clear opinions about the pace of recovery and was not shy about expressing them. He looked at her when she came in the way people look at someone they know something significant about without having met them properly. "Garrison told me what you did," he said. "Garrison tells people what they need to know," she said. "It's efficient. He said you were in the parking lot, that they'd already walked you out. I heard the call sign." He was quiet for a moment. "Echo 7's been retired. Officially. Since your separation date. I know. They activated it specifically because there was an intelligence report placing you at this facility. Someone in Sin's overseas collection network pulled your employment record 8 months ago." He said it without softening it, which she appreciated. That information was part of the upstream breach package. She sat in the chair beside the bed and absorbed that. Months. Someone had known she was here for 8 months before Rourke ever landed in the parking lot. Had known and logged it and filed it as a relevant asset coordinate in an operational network's planning infrastructure. Her quiet life in the basement supply room had been a known point on someone else's map. "Am I going to find out what that means for my situation here?" she asked. "We don't know yet whether your presence at this facility was a factor in selecting it or whether it was collected data that wasn't operationally used. Upstream investigation is still working through it." He looked at her steadily. "What I can tell you is that whatever the reason they knew you were here, the outcome of your being here was the opposite of what they needed." She looked at the window. The late afternoon light was doing something complex with the cloud cover, the way spring light in the Pacific Northwest sometimes did not quite breaking through, but present in the gray, diffuse and real. "How's the leg?" she asked. "Functional. Ferris is projecting 80% return, with full rehabilitation." A pause. "That's enough for what I do. It usually is." She stood. "Do the early mobility work properly? All of it. Don't negotiate with the physical therapist about the uncomfortable parts because that's where the return happens." He looked at her. Something in his face shifted, not quite a smile, but the precursor to one. "Is that clinical advice?" "It's practical advice from someone who has read a significant number of post-surgical outcome reports in 18 months of inventory work." She picked up her jacket. The supply part was always the smaller part of the job. She left before he could say anything else to that, and she took the stairs back down because the elevator was slow, and the elevator was in slow, and she had an audit meeting in 20 minutes. And she was not a person who was late to meetings. The formal reinstatement happened on a Wednesday, 9 days after the Tuesday that had started with a cardboard box and ended with an evidence sweep in her own supply room. The meeting was in a small administrative conference room. Feld, HR coordinator, Sandra Doctor, Priya Nair, and Harold the OR nurse, who had requested to attend and who sat in the corner chair and said almost nothing for the duration. Lena sat across from Feld and listened while he read the formal language of the reinstatement document, which was 4 pages, and which acknowledged, in the specific institutional language of accountability, everything that had been done incorrectly. The improper suspension, the failure to investigate the documented inventory concerns, the absence of any process by which a support staff member's legitimate clinical warnings could reach decision-makers without being filtered through the same administrator who had reason to suppress them. It also documented the corrective measures being implemented, new escalation pathways for supply concerns, a supply oversight committee that included nursing representation, 60-day audit of all vendor relationships using procurement criteria that had been developed with input from the clinical staff who actually used the supplies. Lena read all 4 pages before she signed. Then she signed, took the new badge that the HR coordinator handed her, clipped it to her scrub top, and looked around the table at the people who had come to be in the room for this. Sandra had the expression of someone who had done what she could within the constraints she'd operated under and knew it wasn't enough and was learning to hold both of those things simultaneously. Priya looked like someone who was still working out who she intended to be, which was the appropriate thing to look like when you were 28 and early in a career that would require a lot of difficult decisions. Lena thought she would probably make more of them correctly than not. That was not a given, but it was a real probability. Harold stood up when it was over and shook her hand. His grip was firm and brief, and what it communicated was not ceremony, but recognition. One person, who had been around long enough to know what things cost, acknowledging another. She nodded at him. That was sufficient. 3 months after that Tuesday, in March, Hargrove Regional was functioning better than it had before the events that had exposed what was underneath its functioning. That was an uncomfortable truth about institutional crisis. It sometimes revealed structural problems that could be fixed, and the fixing produced a better structure than the original. Not always, not automatically. Only when the people responsible for the structure were willing to look at what the crisis had shown them. Feld was that kind of administrator, cautious, thorough, not brilliant, but genuinely attentive in a way that Voss had never been. He asked questions about systems rather than individuals. He wanted to know how a supply shortfall could go unreported at the administrative level for 18 months, and what would prevent it from happening again. And he aced in the conversation until he had answers that were specific enough to be actionable. Lena spent a significant amount of time in those conversations, not as a consultant or an appointed representative. Person who had the most detailed knowledge of where the failures had occurred and what a corrective process needed to address. Feld listened. He asked follow-up questions. He pushed back twice on points where he thought her proposals were logistically difficult, and in both cases, she modified the proposals based on his objections. Because his objections were valid, and she was interested in what would actually work, not in being right about the details. The Supply Oversight Committee met for the first time in late April. Lena was on it. So were Sandra, a trauma physician who was not Doyle, a pharmacist, and a receiving department supervisor who had been quietly appalled by what the investigation had revealed about his own department's intake processes and who had, without being asked, spent 3 weeks redesigning the receiving documentation protocol. It was not a perfect committee. They disagreed on 4 of the first 6 agenda items. The meetings ran long. The pharmacist and the trauma physician had fundamentally different ideas about what constituted an acceptable restock buffer and took 3 sessions to reach a workable compromise. But it functioned. And the functioning produced outcomes that were measurable in the stocking levels and the vendor documentation and the clinical incident reports, which showed a pattern that the risk management coordinator described in a quarterly review as a statistically significant reduction in supply-related clinical delays. She showed Lena the report on a Thursday afternoon. Lena looked at the numbers. She did not say, "I told you so," because there was no version of that phrase that would have added anything useful to the situation. But she looked at the numbers for a moment longer than she needed to, and she let herself understand what they represented. Priya stopped by Central Supply on a Thursday in June. She had a question about catheter inventory that she could have submitted through the system. She asked it in person, which Lena answered in approximately 45 seconds, and then Priya stood near the doorway with the manner of someone who had the actual thing they wanted to say still in front of them. "I've been thinking about the corridor," she said. Morning. "When Doyle said what he said to you, I remember. I looked away. You did. I've thought a lot about why." Lena set the tray she was holding down on the shelf. She looked at Priya directly, a young doctor with a good mind and a developing spine, and the specific kind of uncertainty that came from being smart enough to know that being smart wasn't sufficient. You were a second-year resident in a corridor with a senior attending who controlled your performance evaluations and whose goodwill determined your schedule your references, and your professional trajectory for the next 2 years. That's an explanation. Yes, not a justification. No. But there's a difference between a moral failure and a structural one, and what happened in that corridor was partly both. Lena leaned against the shelving. The system that put you in that position where looking away was the rational, self-protective choice. That system failed you before you failed. Understanding that doesn't excuse the choice, but it tells you where to actually direct the work. Priya was quiet. What do you mean, the work? The corridor moment is done. Can't undo it. What you can do is understand exactly what it cost, not perform understanding of it, actually feel the weight of it, and then make a different decision the next time a similar structure appears. She paused. Because it will appear again, possibly many times. And it will probably be more subtle because the obvious versions are the ones that are easiest to recognize and still hard to act on. Did you, when you were doing what you did before this? Did you ever look away? It was the honest question, the one that deserved an honest answer. Yes, Lena said. Twice in specific situations I still think about. Not often. But the not often doesn't balance the ledger on the times that it did. What did you do with it? I looked at it clearly. Named it for what it was, without finding the framing that made it more comfortable than it deserved to be. And then I made a different decision the next time the structure appeared. She picked the tray back up. There's no version of this that involves being done with the accounting. You just get better at doing it faster and more honestly. Priya nodded. It had the quality of something being filed in a place where it would actually be retrieved. She left. Lena worked for another hour, and she thought in the background of the work about what she'd said, whether she was applying it to herself with the same rigor she'd handed to Priya. About the 3 years she'd spent arranging herself into something unremarkable and calling it preference. And about how much of that had been a genuine choice and how much had been avoidance with better furniture. Both, she concluded. It had been both, and the distinction mattered even when it was inconvenient, maybe especially then. In October, Garrison called. Friday afternoon, end-of-week audit, her phone buzzing on the shelf beside the notebook. She looked at the screen and answered. Rourke finished the rehabilitation program, he said. Full clearance for return to limited duty. How's the leg? 83% return. A pause. Above projection. She allowed herself that, 3% above projection, which happened when the early mobility work was completed without negotiation on the uncomfortable parts. He wanted you to know, Garrison said. Thank you. A pause that meant something else was coming. The facility selection question. Whether your presence here was a factor. She had not forgotten the question. She had placed it in the category of things with no actionable answer yet and continued doing her job, while the people whose job it was to answer it worked through the upstream investigation. What did you find? She asked. The access log on your employment record connects to a collection effort targeting former military medical personnel who had transitioned to civilian healthcare facilities located on active federal operational extraction routes. You were one of 43 people on that list. So not specifically targeted, not individually, but not incidentally collected either. You were on the list because someone understood the asset value of a former combat medic embedded in a civilian trauma facility on an extraction route. They wanted to know which facilities carried that asset so they could either use it or account for it. She looked at the shelving around her, stocked, labeled, documented, the room that had been her quiet domain for 3 years and had apparently been a coordinate on someone else's operational map, or at least one of them. They were mapping people like me, she said, to use against us or to work around us. It's our assessment. And instead, one of us found their infrastructure. A silence that meant he was deciding how much to say. There are others on the list, in comparable situations at other facilities, some of which may have supply chain compromises similar to what we found here. The upstream investigation is working through the geographic mapping now. She was quiet for a moment. Those people need to know what to look for. she said. The documentation pattern, the way the substitution scheme works in the inventory records, the specific discrepancy types that indicate a vendor-level compromise versus a receiving error versus a legitimate shortage. That's not obvious if you don't know to look for it. I found that because I was meticulous, and because I had time, and because nobody was paying enough attention to stop me from documenting. She paused. Most people in that position don't have all three of those conditions. No, Garrison said. They don't, so they need a framework. Something written, specific, that tells a supply manager or a charge nurse or a receiving supervisor what the indicators look like and how to document them in a way that's evidentiary, rather than just a complaint that can be redirected. Another pause. Are you offering to write that? She looked at the notebook open on the shelf beside her. Careful, handwritten pages that had started as job documentation and had ended up as the evidentiary backbone of a federal fraud case. I'm saying it needs to exist, she said. What you do with that observation is your department. She ended the call and stood in the supply room for a moment. Then she opened the notebook to a clean page at the back and wrote at the top, in the same precise handwriting she had used for 18 months of inventory logs, documentation framework, supply chain compromise indicators, and evidentiary recording protocol. She stood there for a moment looking at the heading. Then she sat down on the stool she kept beside the work table, and she started to write. Not because she had been asked, not because someone had given her a title that authorized it, or a platform that required it, because she had specific, hard-won knowledge that was sitting in her head and in her notebook, and in 3 years of meticulous records that had turned out to matter, and the responsible thing to do with that knowledge was to make it transferable. To take the thing she knew and put it into a form that meant the next person doing this work, pushing the cart, stocking birds, filing, stocking the shelves, filing the purchase orders that nobody wanted to hear about, would have something to stand on that she hadn't had. That was the work she understood now. Not the supply room, specifically. Not the cart with the bad wheel, or the inventory system, or the requisition forms. The larger work, the work of paying close had decided to things that other people had decided weren't worth attending to, of documenting what was real regardless of whether the people in the rooms above you wanted it documented, of maintaining the evidence of your own correctness, even when the correctness wasn't making anything easier. She had spent years being told she was inventory, that she was the cart and the tray and the shelf count and nothing beyond those things. She had spent 3 years in a basement supply room being quietly, methodically, exhaustively right about a situation that nobody above her had been willing to take seriously, and her rightness had not required their recognition to remain real. It had existed independently of whether they could see it. It had built up in handwritten notebooks and time-stamped purchase orders and flagged discrepancies and meticulous records until the moment arrived when it was undeniable, and then it had been undeniable. All at once, in a parking lot and a trauma bay and a dark storage room and a federal evidence file that was going to be referenced in case proceedings for years. She had not been waiting to be discovered. She had been doing the work. There was a difference between those two things, and it was the most important difference she knew. The woman they had called just the supply nurse wrote for 2 hours in the quiet of her organized, fully stocked, properly documented supply room, and the pages filled with everything she had learned. And the words were precise and useful and entirely her own.